In this episode, we start by using a learning strategy that fits audio-first study especially well: spaced retrieval, which means you practice pulling key ideas out of your memory at increasing intervals so they become fast and reliable under pressure. New learners often confuse rereading with learning because rereading feels familiar, but exams require recall, which is the ability to produce the right concept when you need it without being prompted by the page. Domain 1 is full of essentials that must become automatic, such as what counts as personal information, how principles guide decisions, how laws become requirements, how documentation proves accountability, how roles and vendors shape control, how incidents are handled, and how rights requests are fulfilled. This review is designed to strengthen those essentials by revisiting them in a way that forces your brain to retrieve meaning rather than recognize words. The goal is not to cram a long list of facts, but to build a set of mental anchors and decision patterns you can use to answer scenario questions quickly and accurately. You will hear the ideas connected in a way that makes recall easier because each concept supports the next, like a chain rather than isolated beads. By the end, you should feel that Domain 1 content sits in your mind as a coherent operating model you can navigate, not as separate chapters you might forget. The first recall anchor in Domain 1 is personal information, because every other decision depends on whether data relates to an identifiable person in a given context. When you practice retrieval here, you want to speak the concept in a way that includes direct identifiers, indirect identifiers, and the role of context and combination. The exam loves to test cases where a single data element does not look personal until it is paired with a second dataset, such as a device identifier paired with account logs, or a location pattern paired with timestamps and a profile. You should be able to explain that personal information is not limited to text fields like name and address, because it can be images, audio, behavioral signals, metadata, or derived scores that influence how a person is treated. A common beginner misunderstanding is thinking that removing names makes data anonymous. Yet pseudonymization often leaves the data linkable, which means it is still personal information and still governed. Another misunderstanding is treating technical identifiers as automatically non-personal, even though they can be used to track and link behavior over time. When you retrieve this concept, connect it to why it matters, which is that misclassification leads to wrong controls, wrong notices, and wrong responses to requests and incidents. Then, connect it forward by reminding yourself that once something is personal information, principles, obligations, and evidence practices become mandatory rather than optional. The next anchor is privacy principles, because principles are the decision rules that keep a program consistent across different systems and situations. Spaced retrieval here should include your ability to name a principle, explain what it demands in practical terms, and describe how it becomes a control and evidence rather than a slogan. Privacy by design, PBD, should trigger the idea that privacy is embedded early, maintained across the lifecycle, and supported by defaults that reduce exposure, not retrofitted after release. Consent should trigger purpose-specific choice, a record of the choice, enforcement across downstream processing, and the ability to respect withdrawal where applicable. Transparency should trigger alignment between what is communicated and what systems actually do, including change management that updates notices when processing changes. Purpose limitation and minimization should trigger a discipline of collecting and using only what is necessary and avoiding quiet expansion of use. Accountability should trigger ownership, documentation, and monitoring that prove behavior matches promises. When you retrieve these principles, you also want to retrieve the common exam trap, which is answers that sound ethically pleasing but lack concrete controls or evidence. Then, connect forward to the idea that laws and regulations often express these principles as obligations, and engineering translates them into testable requirements. Interpreting laws and regulations as engineering requirements is another Domain 1 essential, and retrieval here means you can take broad obligations and express them as measurable behavior. A law might require rights, transparency, safeguards, and accountability, but the program must translate that into workflows, controls, and records that can be tested. The exam is usually testing whether you can identify obligation types, such as rights handling, lawful processing, retention constraints, or cross-border transfer safeguards, then choose actions that make the obligation real. Scope is a critical retrieval point because obligations depend on factors like geography, data type, organizational role, and the context of processing. Cross-border scenarios test whether you understand that data movement is not only sending files, but also storage in different regions and remote access by teams or vendors in other jurisdictions. Sector cues test whether you recognize specialized constraints, such as stricter expectations for certain data and industries, and whether you respond by tightening controls and oversight. A beginner misunderstanding is trying to memorize all legal details, but the exam rewards durable reasoning. Identify the obligation, translate to requirements, implement controls, and preserve evidence. When you retrieve this concept, connect it to the next idea, which is that documentation is the place where obligations and decisions become visible and durable. Privacy documentation is a domain one pillar because it is the memory and proof of the program. And spaced retrieval here should focus on why documentation survives stress tests like audits, incidents, and staff turnover. A mature program's documentation answers what data is processed, why it is processed, how it is protected, who is accountable, and how the organization can prove it. Governance documents such as policies establish intent, procedures describe how work is done, and operational records show what actually happened, and the exam expects you to understand that these layers must align. Records of processing activities, assessment outputs like PIA and DPIA, vendor agreements, rights request logs, incident timelines, and monitoring records are all examples of documentation that turns a program into something defensible. A common beginner mistake is thinking a policy alone is evidence, but evidence is the trail of actions and outcomes that shows controls operate. Another mistake is creating documentation that is not maintained, which creates false confidence and leads to wrong decisions. Durable documentation has clear owners, review cycles, and triggers tied to change management, so it stays current. When you retrieve this domain, connect it forward by noticing that documentation depends on roles and responsibilities, because without ownership, documents become stale and processes become inconsistent. Roles, culture, and responsibilities form the operating structure that makes accountability real, and retrieval here should focus on functions rather than job titles. Someone must define requirements, someone must implement controls, someone must monitor outcomes, and someone must approve exceptions and risk decisions, and those functions must have authority and resources. Culture is visible in behavior, such as teams asking before repurposing data, escalating uncertainty early, and treating personal information as an asset with obligations. Embedding privacy into workflows is the practical bridge between structure and culture because required gates in procurement, product development, data access approvals, and change management make privacy behavior repeatable. The exam often tests whether you can spot weak accountability signals, such as reliance on informal knowledge, unclear escalation paths, or privacy teams that advise but cannot influence decisions. Training and awareness support roles by making expectations understandable and consistent across teams. Metrics reinforce accountability by showing whether processes work, such as request response times or completion of vendor reviews. When you retrieve this concept, connect it to vendors, because vendor management is where roles, contracts, and oversight must work together or control is lost. Vendor and supply chain management is a major domain one operational capability, and retrieval here should include the idea that obligations do not disappear when processing is outsourced. You should be able to recall that the relationship must be defined clearly, because controls depend on whether a vendor processes on your behalf or uses data for its own purposes. Due diligence should be risk-based, confirming capability to meet privacy and security expectations and minimizing shared data at the start. Contracts must define permitted processing, restrict unauthorized use, require safeguards, control subprocessors, and require cooperation for incidents and rights requests, with evidence provisions that support verification. Oversight must continue after onboarding because vendors change services, regions, and subprocessors, and static controls become outdated. Vendor controls are stress-tested during incidents, when rapid notification, accurate scope information, and cooperation are essential for defensible decisions. Vendor controls are also stress-tested during rights requests, when vendor-held data must be located and acted on within timelines. A common beginner misunderstanding is assuming the vendor's professionalism replaces oversight, but the exam expects accountability to remain with the organization. When you retrieve vendor management, connect it forward to incident response, because vendor failures often show up as incidents and require coordinated evidence and remediation. Incident management in Domain 1 is about clear triggers, evidence discipline, and remediation flow, and spaced retrieval here should include the privacy-specific aspects that go beyond classic security response. Triggers should include not only attacks, but also misdirected disclosures, misconfigurations, inappropriate internal access, and processing outside approved purposes. Triage must identify data categories, affected populations, systems and vendors in scope, and potential harm, because privacy impact is about individuals, not only systems. Evidence must be preserved early, including logs and decision notes, and a timeline should be built to support defensible actions and later learning. Containment stops ongoing exposure, mitigation reduces harm, and both must be balanced with preserving evidence and avoiding creating new privacy exposure through careless handling of incident artifacts. Notification decisions require a documented process that evaluates obligations, risk of harm, and accuracy of facts, and communications must be coordinated to avoid confusion. Remediation must assign ownership, track corrective actions, update documentation and training, and verify fixes, because repeating incidents is a sign the program is fragile. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking that fixing the immediate cause ends the incident, but mature programs treat that as one step in a larger improvement cycle. When you retrieve incident management, connect it forward to rights and notification, because incidents often generate requests from individuals and must be handled consistently. Data subject rights, requests, and notification are the human-facing capabilities that show whether privacy is operationally real, and retrieval here should focus on the end-to-end workflow. Intake must be clear and trackable, request types must be categorized correctly, and identity verification must be proportional so data is not disclosed to imposters. Scoping and discovery depend on accurate inventories and data flow maps, because personal information is distributed across systems, logs, and vendors. Fulfillment differs by right, requiring secure access delivery, careful correction propagation, defensible deletion with retention exceptions, and enforceable restrictions or objections that systems respect. Exceptions must be narrow, consistent, and documented, because blanket denials or overfulfillment can both cause harm. Vendor cooperation must be built into contracts and procedures, because incomplete responses are a common failure point. Secure delivery prevents rights fulfillment from becoming a new incident, and record-keeping provides evidence for audits and complaints. Notification connects because individuals must be informed when events or changes affect their data and rights, and notification decisions must be timely, factual, and aligned with transparency commitments. When you retrieve this capability, connect it back to the start, because rights handling only works when personal information recognition is accurate and when governance, documentation, and roles support consistent execution. To make spaced retrieval work in an audio-first way, you want to practice recalling these anchors as short, complete explanations rather than as isolated terms. One effective method is to pick a scenario pattern, like a new vendor processing customer data, and then retrieve the chain. Identify personal information, apply principles like minimization and transparency, translate obligations into requirements, document processing and assessments, clarify roles and approvals, enforce vendor controls, plan incident triggers and evidence, and ensure rights handling can include the vendor. Another method is to take a concept and immediately connect it to evidence, such as naming what record would prove a rights request was handled correctly or what document would show a vendor was vetted and monitored. These methods work because they force your brain to retrieve relationships, which is the type of recall the exam demands. Beginners often attempt retrieval as pure memorization, which feels frustrating, but retrieval becomes easier when you connect ideas into cause and effect. The exam's hardest questions usually require you to choose an action that preserves accountability, not just a definition. If your retrieval practice includes who owns the action, what evidence exists, and what risk is being reduced, you will build exam-ready recall. Another reason spaced retrieval matters is that Domain 1 content is the foundation that supports Domain 2 through Domain 4, so weak recall here creates confusion later. If you cannot quickly recognize personal information, risk assessments become vague because you cannot define what is at stake. If you cannot apply principles, technical controls in Domain 4 become disconnected because you cannot explain why a control supports privacy outcomes. If you cannot translate obligations into requirements, program monitoring becomes meaningless because you do not know what success looks like. If documentation is weak, audits and incidents become chaotic because no one can prove what was promised or what was done. If roles are unclear, vendor issues and incidents become slow because decision authority is uncertain. If rights handling is unreliable, individuals experience the program as broken, and that is a serious privacy failure even if other controls are strong. Spaced retrieval strengthens these foundations because it makes the ideas accessible under time pressure and distraction. The exam environment is exactly that kind of pressure, so recall practice is not optional if you want consistent performance. When you build this foundation, later domains feel like logical extensions rather than new, unrelated content. As we close, this Domain 1 spaced retrieval review is meant to convert governance and operations essentials into fast, reliable recall that supports scenario reasoning and defensible decisions. Personal information recognition anchors everything, because context and linkability determine what must be protected and governed. Privacy principles provide the decision rules that guide design and operations, while laws and regulations translate into testable requirements shaped by scope, cross-border factors, and sector constraints. Documentation turns promises into durable evidence that survives audits, incidents, and organizational change, and roles and culture make accountability real through ownership, embedded workflows, training, and metrics. Vendor management preserves control when processing extends beyond your organization, while incident management provides triggers, evidence discipline, and remediation flow that reduces harm and improves maturity. Rights handling and notification make privacy real for individuals through fast, correct, secure workflows that can include vendor-held data and defensible exceptions. Spaced retrieval works because it forces you to pull these ideas from memory and connect them into a coherent operating model, which is exactly what the CDPSE exam is testing. If you keep practicing recall and connected explanations, you will find that Domain 1 becomes a stable map you can rely on, even when exam questions are complex and time is short.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.